CHAPTER 20 Part 3 of an Antarctic Mystery, or the Sphinx of the Icefields. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 20 Part 3 Unmerciful Disaster. Moreover, there would be danger in sending out our only boat on a voyage of discovery, as the current might carry it too far, or it might not find us again in the same place. And indeed, if the iceberg happened to get loose at the bottom, and to resume its interrupted drift, what would become of the men in the boat? The drawback was that the boat was too small to carry us all, with the necessary provisions. Now, of the seniors there remained 10 men, counting Dirk Peters. Of the new men there were 13, 23 in all. The largest number our boat could hold was from 11 to 12 persons. Then 11 of us, indicated by lot, would have to remain on this island of ice. And what would become of them? With regard to this, Hurliguerly made a sound observation. "After all," he said, "I don't know that those who would embark would be better off than those who remained. I am so doubtful of the result that I would willingly give up my place to anyone who wanted it." Perhaps the boatswain was right, but in my own mind, when I asked that the boat might be utilized, it was for the purpose of reconnoitring the iceberg. We finally decided to arrange everything with a view to wintering out, even were our ice mountain again to drift. "We may be sure that will be agreed to by our men," declared Hurliguerly. "What is necessary must be done," replied the mate, "and to day we must set to work." That was a sad day on which we began our preparations. Endicott, the cook, was the only man who submitted without murmuring. As a negro who cares little about the future, shallow and frivolous like all his race, he resigned himself easily to his fate, and that is, perhaps, true philosophy. Besides, when it came to the question of cooking, it mattered very little to him whether it was here or there, so long as his stoves were set up somewhere. So he said to his friend the mate, with his broad negro smile, "Luckily my kitchen did not go off with the schooner, and you shall see, Hurliguerly, if I do not make up dishes just as good as on board the Halbrane, so long as provisions don't grow scarce, of course." "Well, they will not be wanting for some time to come," replied the boatswain. "We need not fear hunger, but cold, such cold as would reduce you to an icicle the minute you cease to warm your feet, cold that makes your skin crack and your skull split, even if we had some hundreds of tons of coal. But, all things being well calculated, there is only just what will do to boil this large kettle." "And that is sacred," cried Endicott. "Touching is forbidden, the kitchen before all." "And that is the reason why it never strikes you to pity yourself, you old nigger. You can always make sure of keeping your feet warm at your oven. What would you have, boatswain? You are a first-rate cook, or are you not? When you are, you take advantage of it, but I will remember to keep you a little place before my stove." That's good, Endicott. Each one shall have his turn. There is no privilege even for a boatswain. On the whole, it is better not to have fear famine. One can fight against the cold. We shall dig holes in the iceberg and cuddle ourselves up there. And why should we not have a general dwelling room? We could make a cave for ourselves with pickaxes. I have heard tell that ice preserves heat. Well, let it preserve ours, and that is all I ask of it. The hour had come for us to return to the camp and to seek our sleeping places. Dirk Peters alone refused to be relieved of his duty as watchman of the boat, and nobody thought of disputing the post with him. Captain Len Guy and West did not enter the tents until they had made certain that Hearne and his companions had gone to their usual place of rest. I came back likewise and went to bed. I could not tell how long I had been sleeping, nor what time it was, when I found myself rolling on the ground after a violent shock. What could be happening? Was it another capsize of the iceberg? We were all up in a second, then outside the tents in the full light of a night in the polar regions. A second floating mass of enormous size had just struck our iceberg, which had hoisted the anchor, as the sailors say, and was drifting towards the south. An unhoped for change in the situation had taken place. What were to be the consequences of our being no longer cast away at that place? The current was now carrying us in the direction of the pole. The first feeling of joy inspired by this conviction was, however, succeeded by all the terrors of the unknown. And what an unknown! Dirk Peters was only entirely rejoiced that we had resumed the route which he believed would lead us to the discovery of traces of his poor Pym. Far other ideas occupied the minds of his companions. Captain Len Guy no longer entertained any hope of rescuing his countrymen, and having reached the condition of despair, he was bound by his duty to take his crew back to the north, so as to clear the Antarctic Circle while the season rendered it possible to do so. And we were being carried away towards the south. Naturally enough, we were all deeply impressed by the fearfulness of our position, which may be summed up in a few words. We were no longer cast away with a possible ship, but the tenants of a floating iceberg, with no hope but that our monster tenement might encounter one of the whaling ships whose business in the deep waters lies between the Orkneys, New Georgia, and the Sandwich Islands. A quantity of things had been thrown into the ice by the collision which had set our iceberg afloat, but these were chiefly articles belonging to the Halbrane. Owing to the precaution that had been taken on the previous day, when the cargo was stowed away in the clefts, it had been only slightly damaged. What would become of us? Had all our reserves been swallowed up in that grim encounter? Now, the two icebergs formed but one, which was travelling south at the rate of 2 miles an hour. At this rate 30 hours would suffice to bring us to the point of the axis at which the terrestrial meridians unite. Did the current which was carrying us along pass on to the pole itself, or was there any land which might arrest our progress? This was another question, and I discussed it with the boatswain. "Nobody knows, Mr. Jeorling," was Hurliguerly's reply. "If the current goes to the pole, we shall go there, and if it doesn't, we shan't. An iceberg isn't a ship, and it has neither sails nor helm. It goes as the drift takes it." "That's true, boatswain, and therefore I had the idea that if 2 or 3 of us were to embark in the boat—" "Ah, you still hold to your notion of the boat?" "Certainly, for if there is land somewhere, is it not possible that the people of the Jane—" "Have come upon it, Mr. Jeorling, at 4,000 miles from Tsalal Island?" "Who knows, boatswain?" "That may be, but allow me to say that your argument will be reasonable when the land comes in sight, if ever it does so. Our captain will see what ought to be done, and he will remember that time presses. We cannot delay in these waters, and, after all, the one thing of real importance to us is to get out of the polar circle before the winter makes it impassable." There was good sense in Hurliguerly's words. I could not deny the fact. During that day the greater part of the cargo was placed in the interior of a vast cave like fissure in the side of the iceberg, where, even in the case of a second collision, casks and barrels would be in safety. Our men then assisted Endicott to set up his cooking stove between 2 blocks, so that it was firmly fixed, and they heaped up a great mass of coals close to it. No murmurs, no recriminations disturbed these labours. It was evident that silence was deliberately maintained. The crew obeyed the captain and West because they gave no orders but such as were of urgent necessity. But afterwards would these men allow the authority of their leaders to be uncontested? How long would the recruits from the Falklands, who were already exasperated by the disasters of our enterprise, resist their desire to seize upon the boat and escape? I did not think they would make the attempt, however, so long as our iceberg should continue to drift, for the boat could not outstrip its progress. But if it were to run aground once more, to strike upon the coast of an island or a continent, what would not these unfortunate creatures do to escape the horrors of wintering under such conditions? In the afternoon, during the hour of rest allowed to the crew, I had a second conversation with Dirk Peters. I had taken my customary seat at the top of the iceberg, and had occupied it for half an hour, being, as may be supposed, deep in thought, when I saw the half breed coming quickly up the slope. We had exchanged hardly a dozen words since the iceberg had begun to move again. When Dirk Peters came up to me, he did not address me at first, and was so intent on his thoughts that I was not quite sure he saw me. At length he leaned back against an ice block and spoke. "Mr. Jeorling," he said, "you remember in your cabin in the Halbrane I told you the affair of the Grampus?" I remembered well. "I told you that Parker's name was not Parker, that it was Holt, and that he was Ned Holt's brother?" "I know, Dirk Peters," I replied. "But why do you refer to that sad story again?" "Why, Mr. Jeorling? Have you never said anything to anybody?" "Not to anybody," I protested. "How could you suppose I should be so ill advised, so imprudent, as to divulge your secret, a secret which ought never to pass our lips, a dead secret?" "Dead, yes, dead. And yet, understand me, it seems to me that, among the crew, something is known." I instantly recalled to mind what the boatswain had told me concerning a certain conversation in which he had overheard Hearne prompting Martin Holt to ask the half breed what were the circumstances of his brother's death on board the Grampus. Had a portion of the secret got out, or was this apprehension on the part of Dirk Peters purely imaginary? "Explain yourself," I said. "Understand me, Mr. Jeorling. I'm a bad hand at explaining. Yesterday I have thought of nothing else since Martin Holt took me aside, far from the others, and told me that he wished to speak to me." "Of the Grampus?" "Of the Grampus, yes, and of his brother Ned Holt. For the first time he uttered that name before me. And yet we have sailed together for nearly 3 months." The half breed's voice was so changed that I could hardly hear him. "It seemed to me," he resumed, "that in Martin Holt's mind no, I was not mistaken there was something like a suspicion." "But tell me what he said. Tell me exactly what he asked you. What is it?" I felt sure that the question put by Martin Holt, whatsoever its bearing, had been inspired by Hearne. Nevertheless, as I considered it well that the half breed should know nothing of the sealing master's disquieting and inexplicable intervention in this tragic affair, I decided upon concealing it from him. "He asked me," Dirk Peters replied, "did I not remember Ned Holt of the Grampus, and whether he had perished in the fight with the mutineers or in the shipwreck, whether he was one of the men who had been abandoned with Captain Barnard. In short, he asked me if I could tell him how his brother died." "Ah, how?" No idea could be conveyed of the horror with which the half breed uttered words which revealed a profound loathing of himself. "And what answer did you make to Martin Holt?" "None, none." "You should have said that Ned Holt perished in the wreck of the brig." "I could not. Understand me, I could not. The two brothers are so like each other. In Martin Holt I seemed to see Ned Holt. I was afraid. I got away from him." The half breed drew himself up with a sudden movement, and I sat thinking, leaning my head on my hands. These tardy questions of Holt's respecting his brother were put, I had no doubt whatsoever, at the instigation of Hearne. But what was his motive, and was it at the Falklands that he discovered the secret of Dirk Peters? I had not breathed a word on the subject to any one. To the second question no answer suggested itself. The first involved a serious issue. Did the sealing master merely desire to gratify his enmity against Dirk Peters, the only one of the Falkland sailors who had always taken the side of Captain Len Guy, and who had prevented the seizure of the boat by Hearne and his companions? Did he hope, by arousing the wrath and vengeance of Martin Holt, to detach the sailing master from his allegiance, and induce him to become an accomplice in Hearne's own designs? And, in fact, when it was a question of sailing the boat in these seas, had he not imperative need of Martin Holt, one of the best seamen of the Halbrane? A man who would succeed where Hearne and his companions would fail, if they had only themselves to depend upon? I became lost in this labyrinth of hypotheses, and it must be admitted that its complications added largely to the troubles of an already complicated position. When I raised my eyes, Dirk Peters had disappeared. He had said what he came to say, and he now knew that I had not betrayed his confidence. The customary precautions were taken for the night, no individual being allowed to remain outside the camp, with the exception of the half breed who was in charge of the boat. The following day was the 31st of January. I pushed back the canvas of the tent which I shared with Captain Len Guy and West respectively, as each succeeded the other on release from the alternate watch, very early and experienced a severe disappointment. Mist everywhere, nay, more than mist, a thick, yellow, mouldy smelling fog, and more than this again, the temperature had fallen sensibly. This was probably a forewarning of the austral winter. The summit of our ice mountain was lost in vapour, in a fog which would not resolve itself into rain, but would continue to muffle up the horizon. "Bad luck," said the boatswain, "for now if we were to pass by land we should not perceive it. And our drift?" "More considerable than yesterday, Mr. Jeorling. The captain has sounded, and he makes a speed no less than between 3 and 4 miles." "And what do you conclude from this?" "I conclude that we must be within a narrower sea, since the current is so strong. I should not be surprised if we had land on both sides of us within 10 or 15 miles." "Then this would be a wide strait that cuts the Antarctic continent?" "Yes, our captain is of that opinion." "And holding that opinion, is he not going to make an attempt to reach one or other of the coasts of this strait?" "And how?" "With the boat." "Risk the boat in the midst of this fog!" exclaimed the boatswain, as he crossed his arms. "What are you thinking of, Mr. Jeorling? Can we cast anchor to wait for it? And oh, the chances would be that we should never see it again. Ah, if we only had the Halbrane!" But there was no longer a Halbrane. In spite of the difficulty of the ascent through the half condensed vapour, I climbed to the top of the iceberg, but when I had gained that eminence, I strove in vain to pierce the impenetrable grey mantle in which the waters were wrapped. I remained there, hustled by the north east wind, which was beginning to blow freshly, and might perhaps rend the fog asunder. But no, fresh vapours accumulated around our floating refuge, driven up by the immense ventilation of the open sea. Under the double action of the atmospheric and Antarctic currents, we drifted more and more rapidly, and I perceived a sort of shudder pass throughout the vast bulk of the iceberg. Then it was that I felt myself under the dominion of a sort of hallucination, one of those hallucinations which must have troubled the mind of Arthur Pym. It seemed to me that I was losing myself in this extraordinary personality. At last I was beholding all that he had seen. Was not that impenetrable mist the curtain of vapours which he had seen in his delirium? I peered into it, seeking for those luminous rays which had streaked the sky from east to west. I sought it in its depths for that limitless cataract, rolling in silence from the height of some immense rampart lost in the vastness of the zenith. I sought for the awful white giant of the South Pole. At length reason resumed her sway. This visionary madness, intoxicating while it lasted, passed off by degrees, and I descended the slope to our camp. The whole day passed without a change. The fog never once lifted to give us a glimpse outside of its muffling folds, and if the iceberg, which had travelled 40 miles since the previous day, had passed by the extremity of the axis of the earth, we should never know it. Chapter 20.